here you are. And I'm hoping that's a positive thing to say. And that, this practice is, uh, it's really based on two fundamentals. I like the words peace and ease. And I used to do a practice where I would breathe in peace and I would breathe out ease. And it was really quite a revelation. But I wanted to start tonight. I want to talk about the aggregates, which are the components of how and who we are. And but prior to that, I guess I have to look at I spent many years in India and doing some different things. But the practice was really the basis of maybe something I could find. And so one of the things was I lived on this Aggregates, which in a houseboat on the Ganges in Varanasi or Rishi. It was Varanasi, so it was sort of the home base of the spiritual seekers, and it was the place where people went to die, and there was a lot of belief in that somehow if you died there, the heavens were more accessible. I don't know, but one of the things I do know is I spent a lot of time going to the burning ghats, where they would take and they would burn the bodies. And it was actually a great teaching. My grandparents owned a funeral home, and well, you know how that goes. But anyway, I still haven't seen what's it 6 feet under. It just wasn't. It wasn't what I wanted to do, But I hear it's great. But they owned a funeral home, and so when I was little, going, you punch the dead body, and see. Well, you had to check it out, I mean, curiosity, could kill the cat. But it was this thing of like, wait a minute, where are they? So there was already some question of where are they? I didn't know where they were. I still don't know what they are, but that's okay. It actually was a great lesson in preparing me for the burning ghats in Varanasi, because there, it's sort of, you could watch the people come and the wailing and then the burning of the bodies, and a few days later after the ashes, then people picking out the bones and stuff out of the ashes. Here we kind of hide all that. We're not anywhere near the what is it, the physical truth of what happens. And I mean, my grandparents, the funeral home was close to came, and he was a minister who, he was so tight. And but for me as a little kid, it's something that most people aren't exposed to. And and these things, they're kind of cool. You got them for so many years and then you don't. And it's such an opportunity and privilege to be able to live through these things. I never thought I'd get old, but guess what? It happened, and it wasn't my choice. It was called life. Well, I got to live this long. That's pretty unusual. Well, for some. But the thing was that, here it is, this temporal body. And the aggregates, the first one is the fact that we have to know and honor what we have. And the first thing we can notice is we have a body, you know, and it has, essentially all the teachings you'll ever want, you know. And so we come to it with one of the things that I think in cultural reference was this fact that maybe our culture was more about disembodiment than embodiment, you know. And so, in a sense, you come to these practices, and you have to be trained to reestablish your connection to the body. And it's kind of the first of the aggregates, you know, and I think it's, to me, phenomenally important. And I have to say, my years of, bouncing around India, um, one of the great things was I used to go to these retreats where we do 10 to 30 days of body scanning, sweeping. And I feel like I finally found out what it was like to be in my body, you know? And I had tried Zen in the States and with Suzuki Roshi and oh gosh, all kinds of different things. But it wasn't until I got to that I actually began to own what it was that was called body. And what is body? You know, it is based on the second of the aggregates, which is feeling. And feeling, it's feeling's pretty simple. It comes in pleasant, unpleasant, or you don't notice it, you know. And I think particularly in our culture was don't notice it, you know. But as you explore that the primal feelings that come and go, and you begin to have some sense of the complexity uh, of being here, you know. And it is, again, it's the body is the tool. The feelings are that kind of responding or um, is felt and lived through. So we have this body, we have these feelings, and we have also that's a second, and the third one is perception. You know, and perception. There's a truth in Buddhist. This is kind of the how you construct the human condition, and perception is simply the first thing that's noticed. You know, so it actually carries no liking or disliking. It's just pure noticing. And the thing is that most of we get that for a moment, but then because of feelings about it, then we begin to construct our world, you know. And we construct elaborate worlds, you know, unbelievable, you know. And um, and they, in some sense, they entrap us in because the perception, there's the purity of the perception, which is the first uh, instinctual noticing of what is appearing. But almost immediately, we have an opinion or a view about it. And that is, essentially called uh, mental proliferation, you know. So we start making stuff up about our experience. And to find, a really a perfect sense of what's happening is if we could stay with the perception a little longer, you know. And what that means is there's no initial judgment or criticism or imagination about what's happening. It's just very bare bones, just what's there, straight on. And this is really and to me fundamentals of the practice is that we're not constructing anything. We are just observing things. And a lot of this practice is just based on observing things. And that the reactions and the storytelling and the liking and the disliking, it all comes later. It all comes after the fact. And so what we keep doing, and I was trying to say during the meditation, is somehow we have to start again. But we start again all the time. It's not something that you suddenly, I got it, you know? And boy, 2 seconds later, there's some thought that goes through or some memory, and boom, adios. I'll see you in a few minutes. And off you go, generating this mental proliferation, which is mostly what we make up. It's not actually what's true. And so, in a way, we have to get back to that pure perception over and over again. It's like, I have to start over again. Wait, I got caught in that. I'm on the train of association. There I go. I'm, headed towards Calcutta, no, or somewhere, and suddenly you go, no, I'm here, and what's here somehow doesn't have the interest or the power or the contraction or that maybe a thought or memory or fantasy has. And we have to keep letting go of that, because our imagination, we can make up just world after world after world after world after world. And it's actually not true. That's the thing. It's just imagination. And one of the things we're trying to do here, I hope, is that in that mental proliferation, or that mind construction, or getting on the train of association, is we begin to minimize the power of that. And minimizing the power of it means that somehow we're a little closer to, sometimes I think of it as a 0 point, because when we start construction, we go 1, 2, 3, we construct, and we're really good at that. I know you are. And this is a discipline that's taking us back to 0 over and over and over again. So there is an actual sense of, there is liberation in that point of 0, of bringing it back to 0 again and again. And I know you've all, you're great thinkers, and you have disciplined yourself in different ways. But it's all based on that train of association. And I see that that's maybe that's not the bare facts. The bare facts are much simpler, and that we can begin to then, we keep bringing our attention back to 0, and then slowly, then that attracts and that we attach to is not so important, And what's actually important is that 0 point, and that's not something. That's actually nothing. I know that's a little complicated, but that's okay. It's not something, But the thing is that when we start attending more to the 0 instead of the proliferation, then there's an actual relaxing that happens within the system. It knows it doesn't need anything. And if it knows it doesn't need anything, then that, what I said before, that peace and ease becomes more of who you are and what your instincts tell you, This is from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Most of the shadows of the life one caused by standing in one's own sunshine. You know, we create the shadows. The shadows are, you know, where we're standing in it. Boy, these schools. So I think in some ways, and this I'm just going to veer off a little, that I think we're all cracked vessels, you know, and we've all had difficulties that in some way have created our defenses. And from this point of view, that those cracked vessels, which is kind of the imperfection, uh, is the perfection. And so it's not that you have to become somebody else. You really have to become who you are. And the cracked vessel is just having made it this far in life, you know, and to honor that truth that you are the perfection of imperfection, and that is just the truth, you know. And you've spent all this time trying to be something or somebody else. And what this is saying, no, I can be just who I am. I don't have to be like that or be like this or whatever, you know, that you basically have to just be honest to who you are. And a lot of our world is built around this, creating ourselves in some image. And that image was something that was passed down to you through the generational uh, confusion. It isn't who you are. And to start to get that more and more, and begin to understand there is authentic you that it's always been there. It's just that we kind of sold it for our cultural, schooling and parents and society, and what's cool, what's not cool, you know. And we start to begin to sense that there is something more to who we are, you know, and that's a marvelous, marvelous thing. And this mental proliferation, this constructions that we've made uh, are actually delusional. I don't know if that's very nice to say, but you know, it is delusional. And getting back to this 0 point is the objective of these meditation practices. Is it's not to make something; it's actually to create nothing. So you're not adding to this personality, worship. Oh, I'll be that, you know. And then somehow we are dealing with something called happiness. And happiness is simply because it sees things as they are. And it's really the interpretation of insight practice is seeing things as they are, you know. And we begin to recognize, oh, I have a choice here. I can go with that idea or that fantasy or that image or um, that pretending in some way to be something, and go, no, I'm not going to go there. I'm actually not going to go anywhere. I'm going to sit in the middle of nothing and not make up anything about it. And that's where the peace and ease actually exists. And that in this format, um, so we have body, we have feelings, we have pure perception, we have mental formation, and we have consciousness. And consciousness is fascinating because there's kind of two levels to consciousness. There's consciousness, which is very much in the Theravadan school, which is just, everything arises and passes away. So consciousness arises and passes away with every moment. So it's always married to something, and you know who that is, and there's more to it than that. And in the Theravadan system, it's really simple. It's just that things arise and pass away. Things arise and pass away. Now, I like a little more expansive view, which Ajahn Chah had towards things in the Thai forest tradition, is that there is another way of looking at consciousness. Conscious is not something that is, in some ways, just an individual thing. It is that um, is married to the awareness, and that awareness is something that it is not dependent on that rising and falling, but there's something bigger, and I like that, something bigger. Why not? You know, and why limit it? And that's bigger. You could say it's universal consciousness. You could say it was, um, you know, that holds all things. I like the word the big, you know, just the big, you know, and it holds everything, but it's not something that you have to name or put your thumb on, but simply can let it kind of be there, the big, you know, and it has this capacity to actually uh, expand beyond the confines of this contracted consciousness, you know, because contracted consciousness just simply is more of a mirror. It reflects on itself. And what I'm talking about is something that, you know, uh, that is beyond that, the smallness of the individual. And so it's holding all things. And the thing that's interesting about that is that we think of it as, okay, all these people in the room and all these people on Zoom and all that. It's so much bigger than that. That is a minimalist view of something that, is the trees and is the Yuba River, the all the birds and the trees and today, I was coming here and I have this like 20 geese that they just stand out in the road, and everybody has to stop and kind of, I don't know what they're doing, but they feel safe in their collective, and we know they're going south, so they go down to Baja or something down south, but they're just tripping on the way, and why not, uh, they're gorgeous, they're noisy too, and but it's great in the sky when they kind of go into their formation and honk, you know? And hey, we're here. Where are you? They're really cool. So these cracked vessels that we have been walking around in all these years, something, can we heal them? Uh, we can't heal them, because that's body, And your memories are stored within that whole complex. And because it's your whole complex, then you have this possibility of you're not going to change them, but you're going to liberate that or who it is that holds them. That to me is, um, a marvelous truth, a marvelous possibility that you can do that. Uh, I have to read this as symptoms of inner peace. A tendency to think and act spontaneously rather than based on past experience. An unmistakable ability to enjoy each moment. A loss of interest in judging other people. A loss in interest in judging oneself. A loss of interest in interpreting the actions of others. A loss of interest in conflict. A loss of the ability to worry. Frequent, overwhelming episodes of appreciation. Contented feelings of connectedness with others and nature. Frequent bouts of smiling. An increased tendency to let things happen rather than make them happen. An increased receptivity to the love extended to others, as well as the uncontrollable urge to extend it. I like that. You know, it's all we're doing, you know, and I think it was very well put. Uh, and I don't think we could do a better job than that description. So the cracked vessel. We gotta, you know, here it is. You're walking around, and so the imperfection of that cracked vessel holds water. So it's not something that just loses everything. It actually holds water. So because it's consciousness, it holds all the stories, all the past. Um, but you're not judging it. You're not, saying I'm not enough or this is not enough or that's, there's no playing with it at all. It's just, oh, I will rest in the nature of things as they are. And I don't need to construct or I spent years kind of going through all kinds of, disassembling. I think it was called therapy, and and no, it's great. But what was the core of it? The core was that I couldn't change the wounding, and I couldn't erase the past, but I didn't have to hold it or make anything of it. And I think that's the great gift here of the practice of insight is that we no longer need to, make it make any sense to us. We just simply have to let go, you know. And in letting it go, not that it goes away, it's just that there's no longer a need for it to be something that we think somehow will heal us or do something. Instead, uh, you know, that 0 point, uh, that is your gift, you know. And so sometimes you could call it, in some Buddhist kind of language, it's, Buddha nature, that you have this, uh, you have this genius that's there with you. And it knows the Dharma. And it knows, yes, it knows fear and it knows contraction, but it also knows love and care. And that's really when we understand that, yes, one goes one way and the other has a different job, you know. And the job is simply to learn how to love first yourself. And then I think you have to learn to love the trees and the creek and the geese and the deer and all of the incendiary marvels of this planet, and then yourself. And maybe first you have to forgive yourself for that judge that somehow said that you had to change who you are. And this is saying you don't have to change who you are. You have to be who you are. And that's much, in many ways, much easier than spending 10 years sitting on a couch, you know, and trying to describe it, you know. This is no, this is works, you know. It's worked for just, you know, 2,600 years or something. So, you know, it's not a big deal, but it makes a huge difference, you know, when you can say, oh, hold it. I don't want to judge that. Or I don't want to put it somewhere. I just want it to go back to this 0 point, you know. And I don't know if this makes sense to you, but I hope so. And if it doesn't, tough. You know, I know what I'm doing. So this is an excerpt from the sixth Gen patriarch. The great way is not difficult for those who have no attachments to or preferences. If you wish to see the truth, then let go of opinions for or against anything. To set up what you like against what you dislike is the disease of the mind. I'll read that again. To set up what you like against what you dislike is the disease of the mind. When deep meaning of things is not understood, the mind's essential peace is disturbed to no avail. The way is perfect like vast space, where nothing is lacking and nothing is in excess. Be serene in the oneness of things, and delusions disappear by itself. While trying to stop activity to achieve passivity, your very effort fills you with activity. To know oneness, release living in the polarity of mental views and extremes. The naturally arising is clear awareness, wisdom, and compassion. The naturally arising is clear awareness, wisdom, and compassion. That's the sixth patriarch, Chinese. It's called the Xing Ming, which is faith in mind. You know, the only thing is that we don't know what that means. Faith in mind, you know. We have to get over it first, you know. So we'll see if I can do this. I have to say, uh, I have hearing aids here, but I'm not going to put them on. And you can question, and I may not hear you. Oh yeah, there's a microphone, and we'll see where we go. You know, outer space, inner space, no space. Um, the way to look at these practices is that there is a practice that goes very deep into, but then out the other side. And so that's one means of practice, and we practice that as going through, going into and through. And then there is also in the world, when we go out there and in the world, if we can expand to hold all of it without getting lost in the minutia. So there are two different aspects to this. One of them is the one that goes deep into, which then comes out the other side. The other is we take the vast openness, and sometimes we see the minutia in it. And so neither one are, there's not a correct way. There is the way. And that way is that we have to um, use what we can. And one piece of it is that practice of going uh, through the inner world to the outer world. The outer world then can be that gives us attention to the inner world. So there, one isn't right and one isn't wrong. It's just that they're different, and yet they come back to the same thing. You know, and so one of the things that I find that working in the marketplace with that expansive. Sometimes you see the minutia of it. Other times you get lost in the expanse itself. So it's why we train ourselves here to find out about the minutia in some ways. And when we find out about the minutia, then when we're in this expansive world of, all this stuff is coming at us: sounds, smells, tastes, images, thoughts, fantasies, whatever, um, that there is this possibility, and it's only a possibility, of actually seeing into it and through it, you know. So they both work. And for some people, I'm really into this thing that, you have to go through it. It's, and people could say, oh, it's like the eye of the needle, but it's a lot bigger than that. You don't have to worry, you know. But it is our ability to really minimize and bring it in, and then you can't stay here forever. This is kind of a little blip in time, and you're going to go out into a world that is a bombardment on your senses, and that bombardment, if you have found the peace and ease within yourself, then it doesn't throw you off. And that's really what I'm trying to elicit here, is something that you can create a stability, that you go out in the, craziness, and you're not thrown off. You're still aware of what it is from moment to moment. That's a pretty big deal.
Great. We've got a question in the hall. Can you start with your name?
I'm Priscilla, and I was curious about you talking about, from the Theravada standpoint, consciousness is, it's a moment and it stops at different, it just moves. And then the consciousness in the Thai forest tradition, which is more expansive.
Exactly.
And I'm just curious, does the Buddha say anything about this? I mean, does he say anything? Did he, I guess, formulate the aggregates, or did they come after?
He was very much, I take this a lot. Ajahn Mun, who was a teacher of Ajahn Chah and a lot of the lineage here, Ajahn Mun, he never wrote anything, but in the last years of his life, he wrote a 27-page poem on the aggregates, these, of body and feeling and perception, mental formation and consciousness. And one thing he said was, all of it is suffering. So it's really, and I know this is very, in some ways, kind of sobering, but it's part of the view that somehow, by not knowing what they are and how they work, we suffer. And so there, for human beings, we have to understand the parts as well as the whole picture.
So specifically, the consciousness.
Yes.
Specifically, that's really interesting. Thank you for adding that. But specifically, the consciousness. The concept of consciousness, is that his contribution, or I mean, this expansive quality, or
No.
did the Buddha ever?
It goes back to the Buddha.
It goes back.
This all goes back to Buddha.
So did the Buddha believed in the expansive consciousness, or the sort of staccato consciousness, whatever it is?
He was a realist, and so he didn't get into even though he didn't disbelieve it, the consciousness, expansive consciousness, but he was looking more at the details. And so the rising and passing away, everything is based on this arising and passing away, everything, and we're ignorant of the fact that it's moving at trillions of moments in every breath, and that's the rising and passing away. So it is,
So was the expansion. The expansion was a contribution of the Thai Forest School.
They put emphasis on the big,
I think,
I don't know if that's the right word, but anyway, it's good enough. The big, it's like you've got trees, you've got geese, you've got, this huge world that is actually in harmony. And maybe the biggest pieces were out of harmony. That may be the whole thing right there. But we're out of harmony with it in some ways. And so in a way, these practices are trying to bring us back into harmony. And by being in harmony, then we're not, first of all, we're not causing a problem. And second of all, we are, in a sense, the Buddhist language was, there is entering the stream of this consciousness that's moving and is not, I mean, it's simple. We really don't want to cause suffering. And if we understand that and we practice it, then we become, in my mind, part of the solution. And that, and greed and hatred and fear are the things that create the problems. So, expansive consciousness, or just consciousness rising and passing away in rapid speed. He put emphasis on that particularly. And that said that for every, or not sometimes a series of arisings of consciousness, it then attaches itself to a thought, or attaches itself to a belief, or a something. And that rising and passing away then becomes, that's the background for everything. And we don't even see it. We don't. All we do is it's happening so fast that it looks like a solid picture here. It ain't, This is an illusion. This is a great, great illusion. And it's very believable, but it's not true. You know, I don't know, Priscilla. I'm just babbling. You know.
Thank you.
Adam, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so there's a question here from the chat. It says, if there has been trauma which is felt in the body, is it okay to let go of the pursuit of details and consciousness of what actually happened? Just meet the bodily manifestation with compassion.
Well, whoever that is, they got it. You know, but again, you know, it's so difficult because a certain level of trauma makes it very difficult to sit quietly and not be overwhelmed by the memory or the whatever of it. So there's that, and that's really why in our culture we have therapy to kind of diminish the power of that. And at the same time, you know, from the cultural point of view of Buddhism, that insight, which then opens the heart and releases the past and brings full attention to the moment, is good enough, you know. So, and I don't know, I did therapy, 10 years of therapy, you know, but I came from a pretty messed up situation. So, you know, one of the things I have to say, you know, I was thinking about all the monks I've known over the years and how, you know, if they're not messed up, they'll last about 3 years and that's it. You know? and then they go back to the lay life, and sometimes they have to do a lot of correcting. And then there are those who had really good moms and they lived really peaceful lives and they stay monks their whole lives, you know. And I figure the rest of us are just wounded creatures running around trying to, you know, dissolve some of the difficulties that that kind of trapped us, you know. And then I hope these practices that untangles or allows the power of it to diminish, and we can get back to 0 point. We don't have to go to 5 and then try to construct and do all this stuff with it, but actually just go back to 0 and notice that if we keep going back to 0, then it lessens the power of that. And you know, unless it's really terrible, and then it's, you know.
So the monks that have left, did they miss it? They missed that chaos and what was behind that?
Well, you know, I think more than anything, it's
Can you
the,
repeat the question? Because if we're not using the mic, the folks
Oh.
on Zoom can't hear.
right, true. Okay, so I have to repeat the question. What was it?
The monks who left
One
the
microphone coming your way, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So all these monks who have left the life of a monk, did they leave because they missed the chaos?
Well, you know, no, that they, in a sense, you can get so quiet that your past and your experiences come and haunt you somehow. And a lot of times they can't stay in that particular lifestyle, you know. And yes, they come back to chaos. And they live in the chaos. And a lot of them, that's where they heal it. And then, you know, they, I know that's my story, you know, is that I couldn't stay. You know, I got all kinds of trouble too, but So I want to say we're at the bewitching hour, but I want to just take a moment to tell you I love you, and that you guys are doing great. And the fact that you're here tells me everything. You know. Oh, thank you. So let's just take a moment. I'm going to extend it a couple minutes here because I want to do a little metta. And so just taking a moment, first of all, there is a great gift in this word forgiveness. You know, we've all caused damage. We've all been damaged. And that we have to have this truth that forgiveness is something we can work with. And if there's any way that I may have harmed myself in any way, I extend forgiveness to myself. If there's anyone that I may have harmed, knowingly or unknowingly, I ask for their forgiveness. And if there's anyone who may have harmed me, knowingly or unknowingly, no matter how long it takes, I extend forgiveness so that we can all live in a world of peace and ease. May I live with an open heart. May I live with an open heart. May whatever covers my heart be dissolved. And if there's any merit or power that's created through our coming together like this, we extend it out to beings everywhere so they may benefit from our practice and whatever merit is created here. May all beings everywhere be happy.